So let's begin, and reminding people that you go down at the bottom and click chat if you want to get on the list for people to ask questions after the presentations and a few comments of mine. And it's better just to wait until you've heard both presentations at least before you decide you want to go to chat. But we'll start with Thomas Pashby, whose paper has got the title of From Metabolism to wrong one, down one, Value in Whitehead's Emerging Metaphysical Synthesis. Tom?
Thank you. So yeah, I've prepared a few slides just to outline the argument of the paper, but I may not get to everything. So my paper, oops. My paper really starts from the idea that that there's a possibility of tracing the development of Whitehead's thoughts from his earlier works in philosophy of science, so inquiry into the principles of natural philosophy. That name has escaped me temporarily, and the concept of nature, so in 1919 and 1921, and then Science in the Modern World in 1925, which he counts as the first in this trilogy of books covering the philosophy of organisms. So some people, notably Lewis Ford, have represented this as something of a sharp break between, so Science in the Modern World as a sort of sharp break transitional work that sort of cuts between the later metaphysical works and the earlier philosophy of science empiricist works. But there's this suggestive remark that was highlighted by Victor Lowe in response to Lewis Ford's book originally, in the concept of nature, these two sentences: the values of nature are perhaps the key to the metaphysical synthesis of nature, but such a synthesis is exactly what I am not attempting, at least not in that book. Now, later in Science in the Modern World, we find at the end of a chapter on the Romantic poets, the appearance of value here. So here's the quote: "Value is the word I use, the intrinsic reality of an event. Value is an element which permeates through and through the poetic view of nature. We have only to transfer to the very texture of realization in itself that value which we recognize so readily in terms of human life. This is the secret of Wordsworth's worship of nature. Realization, therefore, is in itself the attainment of value." So there's this suggestion of continuity, or at least the thought that in 1921, Whitehead had, perhaps in embryonic form, some thoughts for this later metaphysical synthesis. And what led me to this project, to this paper, were the published notes from Whitehead's first series of lectures in Harvard in 1924, 1925, which is the time that he also gave the Lowell lectures that became the concept of Science in the Modern World. So one thing that I didn't note in the paper that I think is interesting, so these lectures as a whole were entitled Philosophical Presuppositions of Science. And in the first lecture, which we have Whitehead's manuscript notes for, there's a suggestion of an extension of Kant's transcendental method. So here's Whitehead: "Every particular entity, by reason of what we may call its relational essence, imposes upon the rest of things a certain systematic character where they tolerate its possibility of reality. Kant worked this theory out for the particular case of an entity capable of the relation of cognizance in the capacity of cognizance. He asked, how is cognizance possible? I suggest to you the more general question, how is any particular entity possible, having regard to the relationships which it presupposes?" And I think that the appearance of these ideas in the first lecture and thereafter in this lecture course really puts to bed, and I'm not alone in thinking this, George Lucas, for example, has written as much. This really puts to bed Lewis Ford's contention that the development of the epochal theory of time, which arrives later in the lectures, was responsible for many of these key features of Whitehead's metaphysical synthesis. So I'm concerned in particular with value, which is really this key term for Whitehead. So in the literature, I encountered two conceptions of value, of Whitehead's values. The first is logical. So this is Wolf May's. The values he is dealing with are more of the sort one meets in the books on mathematics and mathematical logic than those found in works on ethics, aesthetics, and theology. James Bradley. The rational structure of serial self-actualization is understood as standing for the empirical contents of the world as the variables of a function stand to their values. And of course, Quine, I would say, appeal to a property or to anything involves reckoning it as the object of an essential pronoun, hence as the value of a variable. So very standard usage, but is it Whitehead's? I would argue not. The second conception of value that I think is closer to Whitehead's is, I take here from Jude Weisenbeck's book, whose name temporarily escapes me. So she says, whatever concrete reality an actual entity achieves is to be thought of as an indefinite value. The internal concrete organization of an occasion of experience is to be looked upon as a value. Every actual entity is a value in itself. It is valuable in and for itself, regardless of the various ways in which the individual is related to and is valuable for other actual entities. This is a cardinal principle of Whitehead's theory of values. So there's an appeal to something like G.E. Moore's notion of intrinsic value in Principia Ethica, which I'm sure Whitehead was familiar with. And in the Harvard lectures, we find Whitehead using this word valuation. So here, again, from the first lecture, realization means at bottom the making real of value. It is the achievement of valuation, and valuation is a one-sided view of realization. He would later say it's the objectification, the entity as superjects rather than subjects. In the fluent becomingness of reality, even the intrinsic essence or character of an entity is not for itself alone. It becomes a value for other entities. So this, I think, really counts in favor of the intrinsic conception. And I just note here that the use of the word valuation indicates, possibly, I don't have convincing evidence for this, but there's a likely connection to Wilbur Urban's valuation. And it's not just the coincidence in terms of the name. If you look at valuation, there's a similar sort of role played in Urban's axiology by this notion of valuation. But the key question for me is, how are intrinsic essence and valuation related in Whitehead? And just to note, it's curious that the word valuation doesn't appear in Science in the Modern World. It appears throughout the lectures, but not in the published work. He uses the word gradation instead of valuation. Perhaps he wanted to downplay any possible connections to Urban. I'm not sure. He was later a critic of Whitehead. So this connection between essence and value goes through essential relations. These were introduced by Whitehead in the Principle of Relativity in 1922. And essential relations are those relations that make something what it is. In that passage, in fact, he says he's using this language to avoid any associations that might result from using the word internal internal relations. But in Science in the Modern World, he seems to have removed that worry, and he's comfortable using the phrase internal relations, and he announces his doctrine of internal relations in contrast to Bertrand Russell's doctrine of external relations. Whitehead says, it has been usual, indeed universal, to hold that spatio-temporal relationships are external. This doctrine is what is here denied. And in the paper, I note that, curiously, Newton, in an unpublished manuscript that Whitehead certainly would not have seen, although you can see traces of it in Principia Mathematica, the other Principia, Newton's Principia, is sort of an interesting side note, but not really that relevant to the main line of argument. So the thing that I'm interested in is Whitehead's solution to this problem that he more or less notes in Principle of Relativity. But here's the problem. If the intrinsic essence of an entity is defined relationally, then what it is depends on that to which it is related. So internal relations are traditionally those which depend on other things. So a prototype of an internal relation would be the relation of a whole to its parts. If you change the parts, you necessarily change the whole. So what the whole is depends on its parts. If the intrinsic essence of an entity is defined through internal relations, then it seems to present this problem, that it is not intrinsic after all. And so Whitehead's solution of this problem involving valuation is really, I think, the key to his metaphysical synthesis. So just to illustrate this point about internal relations, this is another interesting point of commonality between Science in the Modern World and the earlier works, because this same dialogue of Bishop Berkeley's is referred to in both those books, but with a slightly different implication. So here in Science in the Modern World, it illustrates the doctrine of internal relations. So thought as here's Hurlock Castle in Wales. There it is, very far away, and in the dialogue we imagine these two figures in dialogue, looking at the castle over here and wondering whether the castle they see is the very same castle they would see were they to position themselves on the ramparts. And Berkeley's thought is roughly that they cannot be identical because they're so different. This castle is small, it looks smooth, so on and so forth. This one is large, it looks quite different. You can see the battlements and whatnot. You can see the detail in the bricks. Perspectivity entails that they are shaped differently. So this is part of Berkeley's rejection of primary qualities. Even shape and size are not qualities about which we can be realist. And so Whitehead solves this difficulty in favor of realism by sort of exploiting a loophole, namely, rather than having to say we have two distinct objects with nothing in common, this sort of symmetry of prehension for Whitehead means that the experience of the castle far away has its own reality in the minds of the observers here, but well, I shouldn't start talking about mind, but for the observers here, and equally for the observer here, these observers have reality. So there's a sort of symmetric relationship across distance, and to make the distant actual occasions what they are, they must symmetrically include the reality of each other. So that's that thought, this sort of symmetry of prehension within realization, consequence of the doctrine of internal relations, means that me standing on the battlement looking over here am a part of your reality, part of what makes your reality what it is, and vice versa. And that sort of thought leads to this difficulty of, well, how can anything be what it is intrinsically if it depends on everything else for its essence? And that's a sort of illustration of that problem. And valuation is Whitehead's solution to that. So here's Whitehead. An actual occasion is to be conceived as a limitation, further characterized as a gradation, which is what he means by valuation in the lectures. The actual occasion synthesizes in itself every eternal object, and in so doing includes the complete determinate relatedness of each eternal object to every other eternal object. Grades of entry into this synthesis are inherent in each actual occasion and can be expressed only as relevance of value. So this gradation means that that eternal objects, although they all somehow appear in an actual occasion, they appear to different degrees with different emphasis, different degrees of reality. So in summary, Whitehead's rather neat solution to this problem is so that the essence, what makes an actual occasion what it is provided by its relationships to eternal objects, which being eternal do not change. They are themselves internally related to one another. So it's a sort of structuralist position in philosophy of mathematics. Eternal objects do not change their essence in response. They have a patience for actual occasions, and so they're externally related to actual occasions. They do not change in response to those external relations. Every eternal object is immanent in each actual occasion to a varying degree, as I said, and the valuation is a determination of the degree. Furthermore, the essence of an actual occasion is contextual. It depends on its past, to which it is internally related. So there's this pithy expression of Charles Hartshorne that actual occasions are internally related to their pasts, but externally related to their future. The occurrence of future events does not change their essence. And so intrinsic essence, in this sense, is relational in Whitehead. We shouldn't be misled by the language of internal relations to think that it's somehow all inside. It's not intrinsic in the sense of being somehow inside, internal to an actual occasion. That would be Whitehead's fallacy of simple location. So it's not located sort of spatially within an actual occasion. It's relational. It depends on all these relationships to the past, to all the eternal objects, so on and so forth. And I just discovered very recently Jude Jones's paper in the recent volume on the Harvard lectures, and she talks about something quite similar, I think, coming at this notion of the eternal from something of a different direction. And she talks about the ecstatic superject. That's her term for thought. There's this sort of ecstasy of togetherness that we need to capture what Whitehead intended, to really make sure that our relational essences are not confined to an actual occasion, that there's this dependence and relationship of everything else. So I'll just sort of sketch a space-time diagram, because that's what I like as a philosopher of physics, of this sort of thing. So the solution is something like this. When we take into account, I need my light cones to extend a bit further so they overlap. When we take into account the relationship between A and B, the symmetry of their ingredients in each other's reality is not at a time. It's rather mediated by the past. And so this is an event common to their past. So there's a light ray that connects A over here to this event in their mutual past. So what is ingredient through the past in A is indeed B, but it's sort of B then rather than B now. And the final thing I wanted to say was this. Oh yeah, so this diagram is somewhat misleading because we've got one dimension of space when we've got three dimensions of space. So in one dimension, we have light rays coming from two directions, this direction and this direction. In three dimensions of space, we've got a four-dimensional space-time. Light rays come from each direction. So that's every point on a sphere that surrounds my head, say. There's a light ray coming from each direction. I think this is related to Whitehead's thesis of solidarity. So I think that is more than my 20 minutes, so I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Okay, our second paper is by Lisa Landoe Hedrick from the University of Chicago, Locating Nature and Its Other, a Critique of the Spatialization of Concepts.
Thank you. It's interesting presenting a paper 2 years after it's been written, right? I'm sure you all feel the same who have been presenting. So in the question and answer discussion time, I'd like to talk a little bit about the problems I have with my own paper, but here we go. So my concern here today is to reflect upon the category of nature by means of the nature of category. So I begin by taking notice of a problem in the contemporary academy on the ontological status of nature and whatever is presumed to be its other. So in some contemporary scholarship, the other of nature is usually spoken about as culture or society, or sometimes language and discourse, right? Nature, society, and discourse, these are the three spaces of modernity. They correspond with what Bruno Latour calls the great fiefdoms of criticism, right? Which correspond to fact, power, and language. So in some ways, this third space of modernity was formed, he argues, in response to a sort of growing awareness of the problematic middle between the first two, nature and society, or facts and power. So it was a site of mutual immanence, right, of encounter, sometimes being allowed to engorge itself with either side and subsuming them by a sort of infinite play of signification between the two. So according to Latour, the three spaces of modern criticism, of which he argues postmodernism is sort of structurally still a part, makes it rhetorically impossible to be defeated, right? This is the sort of rhetorical invincibility of the moderns. You can explain anything by reference to one of these, but you're always engaging in the form of doublespeak. So social scientists can only make sense of society by insisting that there are natural laws governing its formations. Natural scientists can only delineate their objects of their discipline by privileging a certain picture of society or culture, namely one that distinguishes nature and society. So the two cannot be separated in practice, even while their explicit definitions disallow their points of encounter in principle. This is still Latour. Everything happens in the middle, he says. Everything passes between the two. Everything happens by way of mediation, translation, networks. And yet the space does not exist. It has no place, no conscious place. It's unthinkable, the unconscious of the moderns. Again, this is the rhetorical invincibility of modern criticism, that nature and society are oppositionally defined, yet mutually justifying. Dialecticians only make things worse by drawing arrows back and forth, right? So there are greatest modernizers on this critique. Don't the social scientists know that before society could construct it, it too had to be built? And don't the natural scientists know that they too constitute society? No less is society constructed and nature real than nature is constructed and society is real. So now my purpose is not to continue to expound upon Latour or to endorse him, but I do think he helps us to realize that there's more going on here than is usually made explicit. There's a dissatisfaction, often inarticulate, that continues to intensify in response to issues that cannot be neatly placed in public discourse. Things like women's bodies, mental health, verbal injury, PCPs, or Homi Bhabha's mythic memory of nationalism are examples. So these are not merely messy cases that need to be placed, right? That need to be categorized. Rather, they tell us something about the need for and the sources of categorization. So they tell us to reconsider the very nature of the conceptual spaces we create, including the space of nature. So in what follows, I first consider how Whitehead can help disabuse us of the problematic nature of the hybrids, in part by helping us to first better understand the concept of nature itself. So if we understand the concept of nature rightly, we're never going to be tempted to worry about how mind or something else might intervene in our understanding of it. We'll never, he thinks, be tempted to allow epistemology to preempt science and metaphysics. So understood Whitehead's way, the concept of nature names that which logically precedes even the spatial metaphors that give rise to the worries about what is within or without the mind. Nature, I argue, as a concept, then therefore signals the total event prior to analysis. It doesn't name a place or a thing, but only this total event, all factors of the fact, as Whitehead would say, that conditions the possibility of inquiry in the first place. Okay, so Whitehead's aim in 1930, when he published the revisions of his Turner lectures, 1919 Turner lectures, was to explicate the concept of nature in such a way that would distinguish scientific from metaphysical inquiry. At the outset of the concept of nature, he writes, quote, "Nature can be thought of as a closed system whose mutual relations do not require the expression of the fact that they are thought about." To think this way about nature is to think homogeneously about nature, he says, as self-contained. He continues, quote, "This closure of nature does not carry with it any metaphysical doctrine of the disjunction of nature and mind. It simply means that in sense perception, nature is disclosed as a complex of entities whose mutual relations are expressible in thought without reference to mind. That is, without reference either to sense awareness or to thought." So then thinking homogeneously about nature does not mean that we can't ask about how or why perception occurs as it does. In short, we can still ask about the perceiver and can still make the distinction between perceiver and perceived. This distinction itself is not the issue. The issue is assuming that natural entities, so-called natural entities, are something out there, mediated by the perceiving subject. So then, in resisting this assumption, Whitehead writes, quote, "For natural philosophy, everything perceived is in nature. We may not pick and choose." Or to paraphrase, nature is that of which nothing can be outside in principle. We already have gotten the concept of nature wrong if we think that its counterpart is mind or some equivalent. So to think of mind as the counterpart of nature is to bifurcate nature, quote, into two systems of reality, which, insofar as they are real in different senses. But nature is not a place where certain types of entities exist. Nature is a concept that sets up a discursive boundary that allows us to consider the primary mode of reality's self-disclosure. Whitehead does not say that nature has complexes of entities in it, but rather that it is the self-disclosure of complexes of entities. The self-containedness of nature is as much a logical as an ontological characteristic for him. The concept of nature signals that to which all pertains. It therefore contains no thing in particular, but is the total event to which all things pertain. So if this is true, then mind ought not to be understood as an intermediary, but a subsidiary of nature. So then, rightly understood, still paraphrasing Whitehead, nature is not the sort of thing of which it is possible to posit metaphysical opponents. To do so would be to let it bifurcate and therefore to get the concept of nature wrong in principle. We therefore misconceive, quote, natural entities if we understand them as the physical substrates extrinsically characterized by space and time. And there are nice connections here to Tom's paper. The doctrine of matter depends upon the erroneous assumption that space and time are external attributes of substance. We've discussed this in many events this weekend. Whitehead traces this assumption to Aristotle, basing his cosmological model of substance on his logical model of predication. On the classical model, a natural entity is understood as an individual entity stripped of all predication, except those of space and time, which are inexorable, even if external. Natural entities are understood as the bearers of facts. As a side note, you're always going to worry if you have this understanding of nature or matter, you're always going to worry about vehicles of meaning, right? To bring us sort of forward to modern epistemological debates. For Whitehead, there are no such things, right? A natural entity, according to Whitehead, is not equivalent to a fact, but again, is a factor of a fact considered in itself. Natural as a concept then does not pick out those entities that are uniquely in nature. It is a concept that models the primacy of perception in practice. It marks the primacy of those physical feelings, the implicated values of which it is the task of metaphysics to elucidate. So then the natural scientist, in dealing only with physical feelings, doesn't ask about the implicate values. The metaphysician does. The natural scientist investigates the spatio-temporal and quantitative characteristics of simple physical, that is, causally efficacious, feelings. Such investigations lay the groundwork of, quote, ultimate elements of which a more complete philosophical discussion of the physical world, that is to say, nature, must be derived. And I'm going to want to come back to this in discussion if it trips you up, because I think there's an ambiguity here between how Whitehead goes back and forth between equating nature and the physical world and not precisely not doing that. So then, according to Whitehead, investigations of the physical world lay the groundwork for a more complete metaphysical understanding of the physical world, right? Which takes account not only of the quantitative, let's say physical, but qualitative, say conceptual elements. Again, there's ambiguity here between different levels of meaning of what is physical and what is conceptual. Okay, so then why does this discussion about the concept of nature and its relationship to science and metaphysics and their relationship matter with respect to modernism's trouble with Latour's hybrids? It matters, I argue, because this hybridity is predicated upon a certain picture of category that remains heavily indebted to substantialist metaphysics. Nature, society, discourse are described as three spaces, fiefdoms of modernity. There's a parallel problem in analytic philosophy of language between talking about space of reasons and space of causes. But according to Whitehead, we misconceive nature if we conceive it as a space, a domain, a realm. To conceive nature as such invites in an opposition to other spaces like mind or society or discourse. If we refuse to let nature bifurcate, conceiving it not as a space that could bifurcate, but rather as a logical presupposition of inquiry, then we undercut the very terms of the modernist problem. Society and discourse are not spaces distinct from nature in need of dialectical mediation. Rather, the concept of nature signals the procedural priority of the concrete, the actual, the aesthetic. Inquiry begins with analysis of physical feelings. And there are very valid critiques of my use of the term concrete here. To allow nature to bifurcate, to allow it others in the form of mind, society, or discourse, is to immediately problematize the embodiment of understanding. For Whitehead, modern epistemology was characterized precisely by such a forgetting of the, quote, withness of the body. But I've been arguing that this very temptation to bifurcate nature itself rests on a prior spatializing of the concept and of concepts in general, a spatializing which rests on a metaphysics of substance. So understanding the concept of nature with Whitehead can help us to resist this temptation by setting up a sort of, you might call, a modernist alternative, according to which understanding is always embodied. Nevertheless, the temptation to treat concepts as spaces itself raises questions about the nature of concepts, questions that can be better answered, you might argue, without the bifurcation in the first place. So George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's work in cognitive grammar studies is an example, you could say recent, of efforts to understand this, what they describe as the bodily basis of meaning in ways that have required them to relinquish the classical category theory. Lakoff, for example, has argued that one, if not the fundamental problem facing research in artificial intelligence today is the dominance of computational approaches to the study of mind, the sort of computer analogy. When mind is modeled as algorithmic computation taking place within independent modules, what is computed are symbols, but those symbols are meaningless. Sure, the symbols computed are meaningful for us, but they can't be meaningful for the computers. Thought, however, is not meaningless, right? So what's missing? For Lakoff, the inadequacy of these models comes down to one thing, the absence of what he calls conceptual embodiment. Meaning is not achieved by programming in an interpretation. The understanding of the symbols will always remain external to the algorithm that way. So therefore, before an adequate model can be achieved, what is needed is a theory of why those symbols mean what they do, quote, to the person whose thought is being modeled. In Lakoff's words, quote, an adequate theory must take into account how the content of a concept is related to bodily experience. So then what we need is an account of how preconceptual patterns of bodily experience lend organizational structure to rational ones without introducing problematic senses of scheme-content dualism. In his 1990 book, The Body and the Mind, Mark Johnson attempts just such an account. His argument is, in effect, that propositional patterns, like we see in logical rules of inference, emerge out of non-propositional ways of being in the world. This is perhaps most ubiquitously the case with the experience of physical containment and boundedness. The pervasiveness of these sort of in-out forms of encounter indicate, he says, repeatable spatial and temporal organizations that we might term typical schemata or image schemata. Experiences with containment and boundedness, as well as one- and two-dimensional analogs like separation and differentiation, entail certain forms of negation, namely restriction and limitation. The sort of work that Johnson and Lakoff have pursued can be variously described as cognitive grammar, space grammar studies, and in ways similar to Whitehead, Johnson and Lakoff insist that we cannot understand meaning without the means, without the body. In Process and Reality, Whitehead reminds us that we do not just see the stone, right, but we see the stone image with our eyes. And it was precisely David Hume's inattention to little words like with that Whitehead thought everyone from Hume to Santayana took for granted. It is the withness of the body, or this feeling the body as functioning, that is the most primitive perception for Whitehead. Without affirming this withness, we cannot, to return to Johnson's work, account for the, quote, means by which anything can be meaningful for us. So in a way consistent with Whitehead's account of symbolic reference as organic function, Johnson recognizes that language cannot coherently be understood as an autonomous mechanism of mind. And here he's countering a sort of Chomskyan account of language, a sort of universal grammar. Rather, he insists, this be Johnson, quote, we have general cognitive and experiential mechanisms or processing capacities that can be specified to language tasks. A brief example of how he thinks this works with respect to tasks like formal reasoning is this. When we reason, we talk about beginning with a proposition or a set of premises and then moving or taking steps towards others. We have a starting point and an ending point, and we take steps to get there. So he writes, when we actually move from one place to another, we experience ourselves as traversing a path from one bounded area to another. This experience, together with the metaphorical understanding of propositions as locations, provided a basis for our understanding of negation. To hold a proposition is to be located in a definite bounded space. That would be a space defined by the proposition. Being in such a bounded mental space, right, involved being contained within certain boundaries. To hold the negation of that proposition is thus to be located outside the bounded space. In this way, the container schema enters into our understanding of reasoning, he concludes. So he's thereby concluding that principles like the law of the excluded middle, either P or not P, have, quote, an intuitive basis in our daily experience with containment. But it isn't just negation that has such an intuitive basis, but all sorts of inferential patterns, including, probably obviously now, transitivity. So in sum, inferential structure, according to Johnson, has non-propositional origins. A notable aspect of Johnson's work is that it provides a substantive way to think about how metaphor works in a way that does not posit something like metaphorical meaning. We can still, with Davidson, be monists about propositional content, but unlike Davidson, he thinks, we needn't remain silent about just how metaphorical statements intimate or suggest new ways of seeing to the listener. Shared understanding is, quote, not merely a matter of shared concepts and propositions, it is also a matter of embodied structures of understanding, which constitute a large part of what we mean by what he says, form itself in our experience. And I think this is important because, as I understand him, these forms are not like Kantian impositions of mind, but more like precursors to Whitehead's eternal objects, because they are, quote, repeatable patterns in an interaction of an organism with its environment. So Johnson argues that this is precisely because of the embodied, lived origins of these recurring structures of embodied human understanding that they have something that we might call public or objective in the sense of communicable character. So this is one viable sense in which we can still speak of truth as correspondence in ways that Whitehead also allows us to do. So consistent with this reinterpretation of nature here, environment also not to be understood as merely external or outside of an organism. While it is the case that the environment is structured in ways that limit the possibilities for our categorizations of it, it is not the case that the environment strictly determines the structure of our experience. This is because there is no independent entity like the environment that could act upon another independent entity like the organism. What we mean by environment is as much a part of the identity of the organism as anything internal to that organism. Moreover, we ought to conceive of the environment as including, as Wittgenstein recognized, our history, culture, language, institutions, theories, and so forth. To speak of an environment limiting the possible structures of our experience in this way requires something akin to a Whiteheadian understanding of experience as involving both objective inheritance and subjective integration. Like Whitehead, Johnson thinks that explanation must move from the more concrete to the more abstract. We will not be able to make sense of the ubiquity of spatial metaphors in language if we do not first account for the ways in which physical containment, differentiation, and transitiveness are formative of being human or animate in general. It is in this way that Johnson thinks he can improve upon Davidson to say a bit more about that, who he thinks does not account for how it is that the literal sense the literal sentence used in any way connects up with what the hearer comes to notice. So while Davidson recognized the importance of affirming the non-propositional side of cognition in order to make sense of any metaphorical creativity, Johnson thinks that he fails to account for the real togetherness of non-propositional structures with propositional ones. Okay, so then to understand concepts, we must begin with percepts. The concept of nature signals the necessity of explanation, proceeding from concrete to abstract, beginning with the aesthetic. It therefore also serves to mark the relationship between science and philosophy, at least in the concept of nature as I'm trying to understand it. While the definiteness of fact is due to its forms, each fact is more than its forms. It is the role of science to explain the concrete, the actual, but it is the purpose of philosophy to explain how concrete fact can, quote, exhibit entities abstract from itself, yet participated in by its own nature. This is just what Whitehead does by elucidating the concept of nature. Nature is not simply an object of inquiry opposable to others, but something that marks the condition of possibility for objectification. Distancing ourselves, if I may, from the habit of placing nature or of attempting to locate it is a critical step in understanding it this way. In order to assist in this distancing, I have therefore discussed Johnson's account of the preconceptual basis of conceptual containment metaphors. An examination of how experiences of physical containment participate in our mental mappings can ironically render the picture of mind as container less spellbinding. To one-dimensionally treat nature, mind, discourse, or society as places hinders our understanding not only of these concepts, but of concepts in general. Both are better understood dynamically and processually. And realizing this can help us to begin to deconstruct Latour's problematic hybrids, those conceptual monsters of modernism, both social and natural, both constructed and real. And so then in conclusion, I ask, do not these monsters resemble our very selves? Thank you.
Thank you. I have a few quick comments here. Tom and Lisa have accepted, as it were, Whitehead's argument in the concept of nature, that nature can be thought of as a closed system, the entities comprising it limited to those capable of being measured quantitatively. That's the physical, typical, let's say, a Galilean, Newtonian at least, approach to understanding of the physical sciences, and pretty popular still today. Both Tom and Lisa find any such concept of nature inadequate, however, insofar as it would claim to be metaphysically complete, but they do so for different reasons. Tom argues that the inadequacy of the scientific concept of nature specifically and closed system approaches generally is the omission of any consideration of intrinsic value, the kind of value actual occasions create, or rather become, in the realization of their aims. To be is to be able to create value, and an entity is able to do so by utilizing two kinds of resources: physical prehensions of past actual occasions and conceptual prehensions of eternal objects. Tom argues with Whitehead that adequacy requires these prehensions to be all-encompassing, that self-creation of value necessarily involves prehending all past actual occasions and all eternal objects. Now, this seems to me an impossible requirement, incoherent, in fact, since prehensive processes involve various forms of limitation. Tom disagrees because he takes limitation to mean a gradation of the whole realm of value of the eternal objects. A nascent occasion conceptually that a nascent occasion prehends, and a similar gradation of presumably of the totality of past occasions physically prehended. I would argue that loss, however, is unavoidable in Whitehead's system. That since actual occasions are finite momentary events, their prehensions can only be of contiguous events. An event fully realized perishes as its immediate successors prehend it. There's no such thing as a past occasion that can be directly prehended except in its perishing. A nascent occasion can indirectly prehend aspects of earlier occasions if those aspects are included in the aspect the immediate past occasion is directly prehends. That is, you have a sequence, you can indirectly present anything that's managed to be handed on from occasion to successor occasion to finally the occasion that you are immediately and directly prehending. But prehend, and the same you can say for with eternal objects. Prehensions of either kind, direct or indirect, however, involve loss, elimination of what is no longer relevant to the nascent occasion's aims. The creative forming of a new occasion with its unique value requires distorting, merging, downplaying, dismissing of portions of what is available for prehension in order for the nascent occasion to become actual. Like a work of art, the aesthetic achievement of concrescence involves real loss in order to bring about real gain. Whitehead would most certainly agree with your claims, Tom, and so do I, about the importance of intrinsic value creation and its conditions. What I'm questioning is Whitehead's claim, and seemingly yours, that internal relations mean relations with everything that has ever been or ever could be the case. But also, I am wondering if you would be willing to abandon Whitehead's idea that relatedness to all prior achieved values and all possibilities whatsoever is really needed to give you what you want. That is, what you want is have a metaphysics in which the finite creation of value and the finite transmission of possible value is fundamental to the nature of things. Lisa focuses not on omissions of content value, but on misunderstandings of the means of its creation. For her, the issue is not nature as a physical fact, but rather the concept of nature, a concept that is a methodology for understanding physical things, a way of developing an interpretive schema of those things. Or, since we humans are among those things, she refers to and dwells at length on a concept of nature as a crucial form of our being in the world. This is so because constructing a concept is an activity. It involves a whole person, not just our thinking capabilities, but all the ways we interact with our bodily capacities and with our environment. A methodology sets boundary conditions within which we exercise our capacities for schematizing facts, for imagining, selecting, ordering, assessing, and reformulating the factors of those facts that are available to us within the methodological boundary conditions to which we have committed ourselves. So even though the scientific concept of nature excludes what is unmeasurable, its creation is dependent on many of those excluded factors of fact. Lisa is not arguing that science ought to include the scientist among the things it analyzes, because it already does insofar as it can within the constraints of measurability. Science is a method for understanding the physical world, and humans are a part of it. But it is a method, not a metaphysics. Why metaphysics is important, Lisa argues, is because it provides us with an understanding of methods. It provides an assessment of the strengths, but also the limitations of any methodology. So my question for Lisa is, if science, at first here, if science is a method of interpretation that provides an angle of insight into the physical world of which we are a part, a way presenting nature for our understanding, but if this method sets limits that create a closed system, an angle of insight that excludes other angles, how can metaphysics break through its shell and criticize it? Can science become, if not an open-ended system, at least open to and vulnerable to metaphysical criticism? And that leads to a related question. You refer to the scientific concept of nature. Well, I didn't hear you in this version of your paper. Nature as the primary mode of reality's self-disclosure, which can serve as the groundwork for a more complete, that is, metaphysical understanding of the physical world. This suggests to me that there might therefore be other modes of reality self-disclosure, other methods for interpreting what is the case, albeit also by providing not facts as such, but factors of those facts. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by primary, but I doubt that science is either the oldest or the most important kind of method of this sort. Cassira, for instance, would argue with your argument about a concept of nature as a mode of presentation. He would agree with that, excuse me, but he identifies 5 such modes as equally fundamental: language, myth, art, and religion, as well as science. And he argues that language is the precondition of the other modes and science the last of them historically. So for Lisa, my question is, if in her metaphysical thinking, whether you are open to a pluralistic methodologies approach, that is, to the idea of concepts of nature other than the scientific one, and concepts of reality other than those of nature that are fundamental as science to be that are as fundamental as science to an adequate metaphysics and even to an adequate science. Now, there are three people down here in the questions. George?
I only recited the Nunc Dimittis of Simon in listening to these 2 presentations, and I'm actually serious about that. It does my heart good to hear such interesting and profound presentations on a topic long dear to my heart by our next generation or the generation after that. In this case, thank you. Nothing more.
Phil?
Yeah, I was just curious that, does the spatialization of concepts have implications for the concept of the geometricization or the concept of time? Critical ones. And the idea of a metaphor in a 1988 book on the depictive image, I try to explore exactly what you're talking about with respect to pre-conceptual or pre-discursive elements of how metaphors depict meaning with greater precision than discursive thought. But the first one I'd be interested in your reaction to.
Thank you for that. Actually, that's helpful. I think I can kind of address one of George's questions in the course of commenting on that subject. And George, I did use the word primary mode of reality self-disclosure. I didn't take it out. So that's a valid critique. To give some more context for where this paper kind of came from, I was having trouble when reading The Concept of Nature and just his Whitehead's work more generally, and understanding the relationship between the concept nature and the physical world, right? Or physicality or materiality. And this was kind of clarified by reading one of Whitehead's handwritten correspondence, one of his letters to Bertrand Russell in 1911, commenting on Russell's draft of the Problems of Philosophy, in which Russell was trying to take issue with Kant, right? And he critiques Russell for being very loose in his application of terms like physical object or physical space, and associating that physical space with the space of science and somehow being more real, right? And we know that for Whitehead, he's not saying that physical space isn't real. It's just, he was a geometer, right? It's just that it wasn't, it was an abstraction. It was a very useful abstraction, but it's not somehow primary. So George, to get to your point, you're absolutely right to critique the use of the word primacy, right? It's not somehow ontological primacy or more real, because of course for Whitehead, the physical and the conceptual cannot let's say in the process of becoming actually be separated, only analytically after the fact, right? So physicality is not somehow more real. But I'm still kind of dealing with that relationship between nature and physics as a concept. So yes, I would recognize that notions of the physical world are abstractions according to Whitehead, and I would agree with that. So on that point, George, if I could respond to your next question, or at least one of them, where you ask, would I, in my own metaphysical thinking, be open to more pluralistic methodological approaches to the idea of concepts of nature other than the scientific one? Absolutely. That's precisely what I'm trying to get at by saying that nature is not, as a concept, a place or an object studied by science that can be equated with the physical world, the hard, medium-sized dry goods of the world, right? But rather, it's a sort of general conceptual priority that we presume, right, in a particular inherited tradition, as being sort of the basic procedure for inquiry itself. So what I said for Whitehead, the sort of precursor or precondition of objectification in the first place. So I was trying to see how Whitehead could kind of help us rethink of nature in ways that didn't fall prey to this modernist locating or placing problem. And there are nice parallels in some of the work I've been reading more recently in trying to understand new materialist and ethnographic research with more indigenous ways of knowing, right? In the work of Eduardo Viveros de Castro that I mentioned yesterday on the concept of multinaturalism. Because if we don't start with a picture of nature as factful and nature as meaningful on one side, we're not going to have to posit something to mediate, something like believings or worldviews, right? But rather we can investigate the very concept of nature that's sort of undergirding that problem in the first place. So I hope, George, that kind of addressed some of what you were asking about. But thank you very much for your response.
Do you have any comment you want to make at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, if I might, I could take this opportunity to respond to your comments, George, about time. In which case, I'll just share my screen again. Yeah, I'm glad for the opportunity to redraw this diagram. I looked at the clock, panicked, and didn't quite get it looking how I wanted it to get it. So the sort of picture I wanted to suggest is that, immanent in events over here are events linked by a light ray, so to the past, and vice versa for B. So there's not this sort of symmetric, which you might also wonder about. You might also wonder about a problem of infinite regress if it were symmetric. So that's one problem that relativity helps you solve. So yeah, in response to the thought that entails that we have pale copies of the past. I mean, I think that's a conclusion that Whitehead certainly wanted to avoid, and that there's this doctrine of immanence that he refers to in his comments to Dorothy Emmett on her book. He said that she'd missed something important, the idea that potentially the entire past is immanent in an actual occasion. Now, then the question is whether his system really supports that contention. So one thing I just wanted to say is it's easy to suppose that, well, we have this sort of pre-relativistic notion of simultaneity. You know, if the speed of light were infinite, if transmission were instantaneous, that would produce solidarity of the world. It would solidity of the world. It would give us immanence of other events in our experience right now, and that anything else is going to have to be a pale copy, and there's going to have to be causal transmission involved. But it's perfectly consistent with relativity to suppose that there is no time in between this event, supposedly in the past, and this event. Strictly speaking, the length of a light ray is 0, and it's entirely possible to say that, well, any experience we have of solidity, of immanence, can't be that which comes from instantaneous transmission, because there is no instantaneous transmission in our world. So the solidity we have, the solidity we experience, the form that our eyes allow us to pull out of the electromagnetic field, is really there, and it's really there for our eyes. We don't just that we see with, as Lisa was saying. So I don't think the admission of the apparent pastness of the events that are ingredient in our present experience, or more fundamentally the sort of proto experience of an actual occasion, needs to be a case of transmission. Now, in almost every case, there will be intermediate actual occasions that sort of throw forward that form. But at least Whitehead's plan is that eternal objects, being repeatable, unchangeable, provide the means for that transmission. And I think Whitehead might see the loss, the sort of lossy nature of that transmission as a feature rather than a bug, because of course the past in many respects is entirely lost to us. It's the sense in which the distant past, Caesar crossing the Rubicon is ingredient in our experience is very limited, if at all. But again, the theory of relativity allows for that in the sense that if we consider retransmission, every event in our past light cone is connected by a series of light rays to the present. So I think that there are resources in Whitehead to make that worry less pressing.
Okay, I better move on.
Yes, sorry.
Lehman?
Oh, yeah. So first of all, thanks very much to both Tom and Lisa. I want to echo George Lucas's comments of being so pleased to see another generation to see value in this metaphysical system that's so rich and offers so many potential sort of solutions to problems. I just want to address my comments to Tom, because I was very interested in this problem of internal relations collapsing into monism. It was the subject of my first book. And so I anticipated right where you were going with this. Well, it's the recognition of external relations and negative prehensions that sort of saves the pluralism of the system, and in a certain sense saves the individuality of the particular entities. So you're quite right, it was Hartshorne who really articulated this. And Hartshorne began with the fallacy of symmetry. And he said that both proponents on either side, those who espoused external relations and those who espoused internal relations, were guilty of the fallacy of symmetry. But what Whitehead saw uniquely was that asymmetry is the fundamental principle for process. And in that asymmetry, you've got the negative prehensions of the past and the external relations, which guarantees, in a certain sense, a certain amount of balance between dependence and independence. So if you think of Newton's atoms and the classical trinity of space, time, and matter as giving you the classical notion of external relations, then what Whitehead gives us with the concept of organism is dependency. So an organism is essentially dependent on its environment, but you don't want it to go too far, so to speak, to get something like a Bradleyan kind of monism where you lose individuality and pluralism. So anyway, just to sort of sum up, it's really the genius of Whitehead to generalize and come up with a concept like prehension, where the essential sort of mechanism is recognizing asymmetry. So I guess my question for you, Tom, was what implications did you see in your views for the very concept of organism? Because your talk was about philosophy of science to philosophy of organism.
Thanks. Yeah, wonderful comments. So, yeah, I think one thing you see coming out of the lectures is the thought that that organism requires cooperation. So there's this delicate balance that allows Whitehead to affirm indeterminism. There's a conditioning of the events, a dependence on its past, but it's not a total dependence. There's this ability to sort of freely perform this valuation, which can include negative prehensions. And there's this notion of freedom, that actual entities are acting in independence from one another. No two actual entities have identical pasts. So I think for the philosophy of organism as a sort of as a thesis about how order emerges at different levels of organization, societies, and so on in process and reality, I think there's this wonderful cooperative vision of how persisting matter sustains itself, that we have these societies of actual occasion acting in concert, but acting individually, and making decisions, making these valuations with sort of faith that these causally independent actual occasions will be making decisions that allow this larger organization to persist. So I don't know if this quite gets at your question, but the picture I see is a sort of wonderful operation of organism in Whitehead's conception is this cooperative effort. It requires faith, in a sense, on the part of each actual occasion that together makes a society, that these causally isolated events will make decisions, will make these valuations that allow order to persist. So I think that's really getting at the heart of Whitehead's solution to the problem of freedom and determinism.
Could I just follow up on that?
Yes, please.
Oh, great.
Go ahead.
Well, Dorothy Emmett sort of said that she thought that what Whitehead was really up to here was what we're essentially talking about yesterday was a unification, and he was trying to unify biology and physics. And so whereas it looks like before Whitehead, everything's reduced to physics, he's sort of turning it upside down in a certain sense, and it looks like biology becomes the more sort of basic science here with the concept of organism. So, what exactly is this organism? It's a generalization of organism. It's not the sort of sense experience that's fundamental, but just something like a dumb dumb throb of existence that does nothing more than just sort of feel its past. And that's very, very different from, anything we've seen before.
Doesn't he have a notion of the function of reason? Where does that figure in this, as opposed to, entropy? Things move up. That little set of lectures he gave on the function of reason, where he counters the notion of entropy to a kind of moving up. Does that idea of reason disappear? Does that play into what you're suggesting? Is it, with respect to organism?
So I am familiar with that book. I haven't read it recently, and I'm afraid I don't have much to say, because I've been so focused on pre-1925. So that's just not something I've thought about yet, but I'd like to.
I think Whitehead has a different project there in the function of reason. In terms of his sort of notion of civilization and what sort of role sort of reason has played in, in miraculous achievements, astounding achievements of, science and mathematics and things of that sort.
Right.
Well, it's time for us to quit. So, well, thank you very much, and thank you both to Tom and Lisa for their presentations and for the discussions that we've had.
And thank you, George, for the wonderful comments.